One of the biggest differences between the sine and cosine graph is obviously the starting point. So we know sine starts at the origin, and then it goes up 1, down 1, or whatever the amplitude is. Cosine is going to start at positive 1. So we're going to use my amplitude, and that's going to be basically starting at one of the extremes. So we've got to be careful when we're graphing that we know that this is a cosine graph, and it's not going to look the exact same. So I find my information. Amplitude is 3. Period is 2 pi over b still, so that's just pi, 2 pi over 2. Vertical shift is down 1, and there's no parentheses, no c value, so we have no phase shift. So I'm going to start with my shifts first, and I'm going to go down 1. That's my new origin. So that is important because that is not a point on this graph. Cosine did not go through 0, 0, so it's not going to go through this new 0, 0, basically. What you could do is draw your little x-axis. Take care of either period or amplitude, doesn't matter. I'm going to go with my amplitude, so we're going to -4, +2. That's the extremes. I would highly recommend, at least for cosine, that you draw those in. It's more important and easier to mess up if you don't do this for the cosine graph. So 4 intervals. My period is pi. That means this would be pi over 2. I could break it down into the quarters if I needed to, but now we have to figure out what shape. Well, the cosine, the parent function, starts at 1. It has my intervals going to 2 pi. Halfway between is where it's going to hit the minimum at -1. And then the zeros come on those midpoints. So it looks like a U. That's my parent function. Every cosine graph needs to have that shape. So now that we shifted my origin down, we're going to start at +2. We're going to end at +2 because those 2 points always line up. Halfway between is going to hit the minimum, which is my other dashed line. That's why it's kind of nice to have those in there. Then the midpoints are going to cross the x-axis, but remember our x-axis was dropped down 1, so we're not crossing the actual x there, we're crossing -1, and that's my cosine graph. That is one full period. Let's do a couple more. So my next one, let's see if I can squeeze this on. Amplitude is 1, but I'm going to put a little negative. Period 2 pi over 1, so it's going to stay 2 pi. We're going to shift up 2 and left c over b, so it's just going to stay pi over 2 because b is 1. So we'll do my shifting first. Period of 2, I'm sorry, vertical shift of 2. We're going to go back pi over 2, and that's going to be my new origin. That is not a point on cosine's graph though, so I'm going to draw my little x-axis. We'll take care of my amplitude. So my amplitude is 1. I'm going to go up to 3 and down to 1. So everything's going to stay above the old x-axis. There's my boundaries. And then we have to figure out period. So I still need 4 intervals. My period is 2 pi. If I divided this by 4, that's going to give me pi over 2. That means every little interval that I draw needs to have a total distance of pi over 2. So here's my first one. That means the second one's going here. Third one's going at pi over 2. So 1, 2, 3, and then fourth one is going at 3 pi over 2. Then we can sketch. Be very careful because it's a negative. So we're not putting a point at the origin. We're going to go to the extreme. This time we're going to the lowest. The end point's going to also go there. Halfway between, it's going to hit the other extreme, which in this case is the maximum. And then my intervals, my halfway points, are going to go on the x-axis. There's your U-shaped cosine graph. So be very careful with the negatives. Be careful with making sure that you go all the way to those extremes. That's one common mistake, is people don't go all the way up here. They want to put their dot on the new x-axis. And then the last one has a little bit different. So 3/4, pi over 2 for my period, 2 pi over 4. No vertical shift, but we're going to the right, pi over 2 units. So I'm going to go over pi over 2. That's my new origin, which is nice because my x-axis didn't shift. So then we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4 tick marks. Total period is pi over 2. So my starting point was pi over 2. Add the period. I'm going to stop at pi. Amplitude is 3/4. Don't worry so much about making it a tiny little distance because it's just going to be hard to draw your graph. So as long as you label them, you're fine. There's my boundaries. It's a positive, so I'm going to go up to the maximum. Halfway below, we're going to hit the minimum. This time we actually are crossing the x because there's been no vertical shift. And there are your cosine graphs.